Our first panel of the day is Yiddish translations and post-vernacularity. We will have talking Izzy Posen from the University College London. Sorry, I will present, first of all, I will present Izzy. Izzy Posen is a research associate with the Contemporary Hasidic Yiddish Research Group at University College London. He also works as a professional Yiddish translator and as a writer in his native dialect of Hasidic Yiddish. His work focuses on Yiddish and Hebrew sociolinguistics in Hasidic communities, as well as on developing scientific literature in contemporary Hasidic Yiddish. Izzy also works with historical Yiddish and Hebrew documents, particularly in the context of family history research. And the title of Izzy Posen's presentation is Contemporary Hasidic Yiddish, Translating for a Non-Standardized Dialect. Please.
Thank you, Cynthia. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay, lovely. I'll share my screen. Is that all fine?
Yes.
Excellent. I'll be talking about translating into contemporary Hasidic Yiddish. Contemporary Hasidic Yiddish is a unique dialect of Yiddish used by roughly 1 million speakers across the world, mainly in Hasidic communities. Despite regional differences, which I'll discuss in a moment, a shared international network and literature, as well as unique shared linguistic features, justify seeing it as its own dialect. And this is research that's been emerging really only over the last decade. And there's quite a few academics vigorously working on mapping out these linguistic features. As a living minority language, it is constantly undergoing dynamical changes, both internal and external through language contact with co-territorial majority languages. Only recently has contemporary Hasidic Yiddish began receiving appropriate academic attention as a unique dialect, and the reasons for why it's been neglected over so many decades of the 20th century are discussed by Gabbay in a 2018 article, but I won't go into it. In this presentation, I will discuss some of the challenges arising from translating into this dialect, building on case studies from my own work as a translator, my background as a native speaker of Hasidic Yiddish. I will propose some principles and guidelines for handling these dilemmas. Let's talk briefly about the translation landscape when it comes to Hasidic Yiddish. So the immediate problem is that there's a lack of precise terminology to be used both by clients, agencies, and linguists alike. So often you'll just have Yiddish, but that underspecifies the dialect. Recently, some agencies have started talking about Yiddish US, with which they mean the Hasidic community in New York, but that is really inaccurate given that this is much larger than New York, as we'll discuss in a moment. The result is that you have well-meaning Yiddish students and even academic linguists who attempt translations, which are mostly intended for the Hasidic community, but they're not familiar with the dialect. Standard Yiddish, developed by Yibu in the 20th century, often known as Klal Yiddish, is the one taught in universities. It has standard grammars, reference works, dictionaries, but it does not reflect the dynamical realities of contemporary Hasidic Yiddish. I'll just briefly mention a few examples. So orthography is the first one, and I give here a few examples. You can read more about it in an article by Kamoshida from 2008. So these orthographic differences can come across as quite jarring to Hasidic speakers who are used to seeing very different orthographic standards in the Hasidic newspapers. Then standard Hebrew Yiddish uses terms which would be considered today by Hasidic speakers archaic, artificial, or even pretentious. And as one community leader told me when discussing translation in the context of COVID guidance. She said that these translations, these standard Yibo translations, come across as creepy, she said, when directed towards the Hasidic community, because I think it signals that these are like, outside academic secularists kind of telling the Hasidic community what to do. The suggestion is that the industry starts referring to contemporary Hasidic Yiddish explicitly, and I suspect that as more research uncovers the linguistic features of contemporary Hasidic Yiddish, this will start taking over. Also, the lack of accreditation for this minority language means that there's a large space for charlatans to come and convince agencies that they are experts in the language. And anyone working in this industry regularly comes across requests to proofread pieces that are almost gibberish and have just been done by people who think they can get away with it. And machine translation, although very good for other languages, is not yet fit for purpose for Yiddish, especially Hasidic Yiddish, although one suspects that within the next few years, maybe even less, this will change. And I know some people are working on this as well. I'll briefly give some examples. So this is guidance sent out by a government agency in England in Yiddish. And this is just an example of either a charlatan doing this job or a machine translation. I've marked this. So the red is examples of mistakes which are wrong in any dialect of Yiddish. So they're simple mistakes. The orange are cases where it would be correct, perhaps in standard Hebrew Yiddish, but would be absolutely incorrect in Hasidic Yiddish. And keep in mind that this guidance was directed towards the Hasidic community. And the purple are examples of where this may be correct for an American Hasidic Yiddish audience, but incorrect for a British Hasidic Yiddish audience. And I'll talk more in a moment about these differences. Here's another example. This is a leaflet that came through my front door by Transport for London. And again, I've marked it. The red are simple mistakes and the orange are differences of dialect. And just one example. So the translators have your say as Hob Dan Zug. And this is a calc, have your say. In Yiddish, you can't say Hob Dan Zug. That doesn't make sense. You'd say Geb Dan Daya, but you can't say Hob Dan Zug. That is a simple calc, which can only be produced by somebody not very familiar with the language. This can result in quite disastrous outcomes. This is an article from New York during the measles outbreak, which affected especially the Hasidic community. The New York Department of Health spent tens of thousands of dollars, in fact, for a campaign to deal with measles. And in fact, they ended up producing something so terrible, close to gibberish, and this really undermined confidence in public health, because many people in the community who are anyway skeptical of government organizations said, well, if they can't get the Yiddish right, why should we trust them on our health? So this is something to be careful of. Just if I can be a tiny bit cheeky, if I may, this is an example from the Network for the Study of Jewish Translation and Multilingualism in the Modern and Contemporary Ages. And I've taken a screenshot of the translation of this name from the website, and I've taken the liberty of marking it. And in red, you can see examples of mistakes which would be incorrect in any dialect of the language. And below, I've given two suggestions. So I've given the way it would be correct to write it in the Yibo standard, which is the top Yiddish suggestion. And at the bottom, I gave an example of how it might be written in contemporary Hasidic Yiddish. Let's talk briefly about the regional and dialectical particularities within this dialect. The main differences are between Israel and Anglophone countries. Israel and New York both have the largest populations of Hasidic Yiddish-speaking individuals. And in Israel, unsurprisingly, you have significant influences from modern Hebrew in the form of Hebraisms. And also, in terms of historical development, Israel, through the Yerushalmi dialect, also has influences from Northeastern Yiddish, otherwise known as Litvish Yiddish, which was spoken before the war in Lithuania and Belarus and other places. which are otherwise not features found in other dialects of Hasidic Yiddish. Anglophone countries, as you can expect, have significant influence from English in the form of Anglicisms, and we'll talk more about it in a moment. And they are mostly based on Central Yiddish dialects, mainly Hungarian dialects in New York and Polish dialects in Europe. So here's a few examples of where a translator needs to be attuned to these differences. So for example, computer in diaspora Anglophone Hasidic Yiddish, you'd write it computer, whereas in Israel, you can find more commonly machshev, which is from the Hebrew. And even words, internationalisms, which are found in all dialects, will be spelled differently. So in diaspora, you will spell it with the usual Yiddish orthography, with the ions internet, whereas in Israel, you'll find more commonly spelled according to the Hebrew spelling. Even within Anglophone dialects, there are less significant, but still differences between, for example, New York Hasidic Yiddish and English Hasidic Yiddish. So one way in which this is seen is in the accent of the Anglicism. So obviously in New York Yiddish, the Anglicisms will have an American accent, whereas in English it will have a British accent. For historical reasons, New York Yiddish is more comfortable with nativized Anglicisms, and they are very common in New York Yiddish, Hasidic Yiddish dialects, words like muffen, badern, wocken, watschen, and so on, which all come from English, and these are less common in European Hasidic Yiddish. And also, as I've mentioned, New York Hasidic Yiddish derives primarily from Hungarian dialects of Central Yiddish, whereas European dialects have a more strong Polish Yiddish component. And here's just some examples where in New York, you might say badern, which comes from the word to bother, whereas you wouldn't say that in Europe, you'll say the Yiddish Germanic aden. And even words that are the same, like bus, which an Anglicism that made it into all Anglophone dialects of Yiddish, in New York will be boss, whereas in Europe will be bus. I'll skip this due to time constraints, but just to show that there are other differences in Europe, for example, the Antwerp Yiddish, which has influences from Flemish and French. I'll skip this for now. Let's talk about internationalisms. So contemporary Hasidic Yiddish is a high context vernacular used in community settings and family life. It does not have a developed specialist literature or formal education in technical texts, therefore has an underdeveloped technical terminology and jargon. And there is widespread code switching in all domains that kind of go beyond the narrow areas of the community, business, industry, legal, scientific, and so on. I don't have time to show an example, but it's very common when people talk about different domains to do a lot of code switching. So this creates a dilemma for translators. Given how much code switching there is, the question is, when you translate documents into Yiddish, how much of the Anglicisms and internationalisms do you include? And to help us make sense of these dilemmas, I've developed some principles to guide us in making these decisions. And here are a few principles. Principle number one, a good informational translation. And I'm talking here specifically about the genre of informational literature. Examples are COVID guidance, medical advice, government communication. Different genres like advertising have different principles and considerations. So a good informational translation should be accessible and comprehensible, fulfilling its primary role of communication. This is self-understood. Translation should feel native and familiar, evoking a Heimish native style and modes of communication. A good informational translation should have the appropriate formal tone as required by the genre, lending authority to the material and coming across as professional. And a good translation, especially in novel domains, expands the reader's vocabulary, introducing new concepts and terms. Now, as you can immediately see, there's tensions between these principles. So for example, between principle 1 and 4, there's a tension because if you want to introduce new vocabulary, obviously that can come across, can come at a cost of accessibility. And likewise, between 2 and 3, there's a tension because if you want to use more Heimish sounding styles, that might come at a cost of sounding formal and professional. So these principles need to be balanced against each other. And particularly when talking about internationalisms and Anglicisms, this might aid in accessibility and understanding, given that these Anglicisms are commonly used terms. On the other hand, it might compromise on professionalism and authority. So from these principles, I've developed a few guidelines, and these do not pretend to be comprehensive, but just as a start on how to deal with Anglicisms in diaspora dialects of Hasidic Yiddish. So principle number one, if an Anglicism is better known, it is used in writing, and no equivalent Yiddish term will communicate as clearly, then use the Anglicism. So examples are, for example, planning. So in the context of planning application or planning law, given that Hasidim use this term a lot in the industry, everyone knows the word planning, and I would prefer that term over the more kind of pure Yiddish Planierung, which would be understood but would not communicate the technical aspect of planning law and planning applications. Likewise, a word like update, there is a Yiddish term, der Handtigung, but it's not used by Hasidim, and it would not necessarily be understood in the same way as simply update, which is highly used. And by the way, here again, you can see the regional differences. In American Hasidic Yiddish, you say update, whereas in Britain, you say update. Principle number two, if both the Yiddish term and an Anglicism are well known and used, and to a similar degree are equally clear and communicative, the Yiddish term should be preferred. And by the way, when I say to a similar degree, that's where there's an element of subjectivity, and different linguists will have different priorities in judging what means known to a similar degree. So some examples: for disability, you can use the Anglicism disability, and you do find that, but there's a perfectly good Yiddish word, Begrenzung, that is well known and used, and I would prefer that term. Likewise, a word for injection, you do find injection. However, there's a perfectly good word that's understood by everyone, which is Anspritz, so I would prefer that term. Finally, if no term is known, for example, when introducing a new concept, then I suggest using a Yiddish term with the Anglicism /English in brackets. So for example, in my scientific translations of physics, when I introduce the term power, which obviously has a technical meaning in physics, I use the Yiddish koyach, but in brackets I put power because the student, it will be beneficial for the students to familiarize themselves with the English term as well, which they're likely to encounter in physics textbooks. Likewise, a word like protective custody, this term is not necessarily known in Yiddish vocabulary in any language, so I use the Yiddish xxth, which is not necessarily known, but neither is the English. I use xxth, and in brackets, I can put the protective custody. And two things to notice here. So firstly, I'm introducing the English term, again, because in a bureaucratic context, somebody likely to use these services will be talking with an English official, so it's good for them to know the term protective custody. And the two things to notice are, firstly, again, there's a dialectal difference between America, where it would be custody, and Europe, England, where it would be custody. And also, there's two ways to do this. You can either transliterate the English and write in Yiddish letters protective custody, or you can just put the English term in Latin alphabet, and actually both forms are found in Yiddish writings, and I don't have a clear precedence and this a clear preference, and this will depend on the taste of linguists. So I'm almost summing up, just two small nuances. Generally, when dealing with Anglicisms in transliteration, try to avoid phonemes that don't have equivalents in Yiddish, such as W and TH. So, for example, when I talked about power, I explicitly didn't transliterate it because it's almost impossible to transliterate power in Yiddish, given that it doesn't have the word vowel. And the second thing to notice is that sometimes the Anglicism and its Yiddish equivalent convey subtle semantic differences. An example is education versus chinuch, where chinuch would be used exclusively for Jewish education, whereas education could be used to indicate secular education. To sum up, contemporary Hasidic Yiddish is a living dialect that is dynamical and evolving, imposing artificial and prescriptive rules from the standardized dialect. I think dialect is not correct to use when it comes to a standardized language, but perhaps the supra-dialect, the standardized academic form of Hebrew Yiddish. So imposing these rules results in suboptimal translations that can be difficult to comprehend and can signal lack of cultural sensitivity. Translators have to be conscious and aware of the regional dialectical differences avoiding dialectal features in material intended for a different regional audience, and translators must weigh out conflicting principles when making language choices about anglicisms and internationalisms. Familiarity with the dynamical realities of the language is key to getting this balance right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Easy Posen. Please send me by email your corrections on the title of the network. I will confront it with the people who translated it. We will start now with Shiri Shapira, who will talk reading through post-vernacularity. Shiri is a PhD candidate exploring Jewish metafiction in the 21st century, as well as a Yiddish teacher at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev in Beersheba. Her article, "There is no such thing as Yiddish literature, metafictional dabbling in Isaac Bashevis Singer's Van Vliet Kava," will appear soon in the journal Studies in American Jewish Literature. She has published many translations of German, English, and Yiddish literature to Hebrew, and is currently working on her own volume of short fiction in Yiddish. Please, Shiri, you can start now.
Thank you, Cynthia. I'm happy to participate. I will just share my presentation. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yeah, you see it? And can you hear me well?
Yes, everything is working.
Just a second. Okay, great. So the title of my presentation is Reading Through and Beyond Post-Vernacularity. If you're not familiar with this term, I will explain it shortly. But let's jump in. So I will ask two primary questions to begin with. One is, how does Jewish literature inscribe the loss of a Jewish language? And also, how does the notion of this loss invigorate creative production in a medium whose only resource is language? So in this paper, I will explore these questions in the realm of Jewish American literature and observe it through the portrayal of translation from Yiddish and Hebrew in works by Cynthia Ozick and Joshua Cohen. I would like to preface this reading by postulating the loss of Yiddish not simply as a language, but as a concept undergoing a form of translation. For example, post-war American culture appropriates what Benjamin Schreier dubs, quote, an image of Yiddish as the signifier of American Jewry's past. This is an image replete with a moribund vocabulary. Here I will show that the lachrymose view of the Yiddish language in Jewish American literature is not only prevalent in the representation of Yiddish, but that it also translates to the very concept of a Jewish language. In this analysis, I will employ Jeffrey Chandler's concept of post-vernacularity, referring to the state of Yiddish culture since the second half of the 20th century. Now, as we have seen in Izzy's presentation, Yiddish is definitely not dead, but I'm speaking about a perception of Yiddish as dead. So Chandler coined this term to describe how the perception of a language as dead or dying facilitates communication in what he calls the post-vernacular mode, in which, and I quote, the language's primary level of signification is narrowing in scope. At the same time, its secondary or meta level of signification, the symbolic value invested in the language apart from the semantic value of any given utterance in it, is expanding. So since the title of what we're doing here is workshop, I would like to workshop with anyone willing to engage whether post-vernacularity can be a helpful tool not only as a social linguistic concept, but also as a helpful lens for literary analysis. This paper then aims to contribute to the field of literary studies but I hope it provokes larger insights regarding the narratives associated with Jewish languages and how we perceive them in the theory and practice of translation. So Chandler's post-vernacularity is characterized by the engagement with Yiddish, but not necessarily in Yiddish. This peculiar situation can be well exemplified through Cynthia Ozik's novella, Envy or Yiddish in America. This text, first published in 1969, has been widely studied as a depiction of the diminishing of Yiddish language and literature in post-war America. Its protagonist, Edelstein, an aging Yiddish poet, envies Ostrover, a Yiddish prose writer who has become successful because his work is translated to English. Edelstein then sets out on a desperate search after a translator of his own. He is characterized as a vampire preying on young blood to keep him alive, and as a dibuk haunting the living. Yet he knows that the immortality he seeks for his poetry will also be a kiss of death for the Yiddish original, which will be eliminated through the act of translation. So in Ozik's novella, the instances of reference to Yiddish and its speakers as dead are numerous. The language was lost, murdered, says the omniscient narrator. And also, to speak of Yiddish was to preside over a funeral. Accordingly, there is very little engagement with what is produced in the language. His Yiddish doesn't matter, says one of the translators in the novella about Ostrover, the Yiddish writer who receives accolades in English translation. She also says, nobody's Yiddish matters. Whatever's in Yiddish doesn't matter. This is a harsh statement that immediately activates the post-vernacular mode. The entire novella as well also prefers the fact that a work has been produced in Yiddish over its content, focusing on the double bind of survival and erasure that translation from a quote-unquote dying language ostensibly involves. Moreover, when looking into the origins of this novella and into Ozik's vision of the new Yiddish as a more Jewishly informed American English, it seems that Yiddish didn't matter so much to Ozik herself. Sorry? Although Ostrover in Ozik's novella clearly invokes the Yiddish author Isaac Bashevis Singer, Ozik reported drawing the inspiration for the story from the experience of Hebrew writers in mid-20th century America. Thus, we witness instances of translation not only in, but also around this text. Ozik had translated the plight of Hebrew writers to that of Yiddish writers, and inscribed it as a sickly dependence upon translators who show little interest in the original. So I argued that the lachrymose symbolic view of Yiddish in Jewish American literature of recent decades is not only prevalent in the representation of Yiddish, but that it also translates to the very concept of a Jewish language. This post-vernacular quality is most salient when focusing on the theme of translation. And to strengthen this claim, I will further observe the image of a translator in a more recent text. In 2011, a special section of the online magazine Guernica, dedicated to the innovative memoir, featured a short piece by Joshua Cohen titled Imaginary Appreciations of Myself as Hebrew Poet. Although this text portrays a Hebrew poet named Joshua Cohen, it is anything but a memoir and can be better described as a delightfully confusing short story about a Hebrew poet of the same name, told from the perspective of the poet's English translator. This translator is an unnamed Jewish American woman who recounts several conflicting stories of their first acquaintance, thus immediately marking herself an unreliable narrator. The image of the poet keeps blurring as his translator cites an imaginary study on his work, giving the impression that his figure serves as a metonym for modern Hebrew culture. The narrator says, quote, "According to Cohen, Israel's politics were originally apoetics, and its military tactics merely implementations of national verse. Throughout the story, the Hebrew poet anticipates the loss of Hebrew as a poetic language based on a history of discontinuity of the language, implying that the modern Hebrew nation is unsustainable precisely because it is based in textuality. This is a striking symbolic use of modern Hebrew. And what is more striking is that the narrator accepts this view, but also abandons it in a way. As the story progresses, she occupies more and more space at the expense of the Hebrew poet, devising multiple wild narratives about the relationship and thus distancing herself from any commitment to a Hebrew original she may translate. Despite belonging to different generations, Ozick and Cohen treat Jewish languages with similar degrees of familiarity and remove. Both works I mentioned here activate the post-vernacular mode through the character of the uneasy mediator. The underscored presence of the translator in both texts is rather remarkable in Anglophone culture, as a culture which tends to render the translator invisible, in Lawrence Venuti's terms. This visibility invites us to focus on the very act of translation as the core narrative of contemporary Jewish American engagement with Jewish languages. However, Cohen's story reflects a more complex undercurrent of post-vernacularity. His translator of the Hebrew poet, cites her imaginary poet, saying, quote, "He once said to me, current historical purpose of Hebrew poetry to create noble savages, to create poets to become envied by Jews who don't speak or write in Hebrew. This envy is very different from the one encapsulated in the title of Ozick's novella. Ozick's protagonist envies another contemporary Yiddish writer because his work is translated to a non-Jewish language, thus confirming the redundancy of Yiddish, but still maintaining its value as a symbol of the Jewish American past. The envy Cohen refers to is aimed at the opposite direction, to the speaker of a Jewish language. But this envy is admittedly imaginary. The story only alludes to envy as a desired emotion that is very much disconnected from the actual object of envy. This situation is also highly post-vernacular. Here, the Jewish language signifies the evasiveness of an object of both yearning and rejection, with only little reference to what content may be expressed in the Jewish language. Moreover, Cohen's story involves various acts of translation, translations from Hebrew to English by an unreliable translator, and from the autobiographical self, that is Joshua Cohen, to the fictional other, which is the imaginary poet, Joshua Cohen, Hebrew poet Joshua Cohen. And those create a sort of double negation. This double negation is expressed twice over, and these are not quotes, but just me paraphrasing what is happening here. It's as if Cohen is saying, you know, I am not a Hebrew poet, but I will present myself as an imaginary one. And he also says, the Hebrew poet, which I am not, can only be accessed through a translation that is not to be trusted. This is very confusing. And it is tempting to interpret these layers of irony and metafictional play in a deconstructive manner and conclude that they point to a lack of source, be it the Hebrew poet or the Hebrew text. Yet Cohen's translator does acknowledge an original. She simply abandons it in order to tell multiple stories involving the act of translation. So instead of a deconstructive reading, I propose relying on the valence of post-vernacularity as a quality that, as Chandler defined it himself, quote, underscores the presence and the value of discontinuity as a productive force in Jewish culture. So, in other words, the discontinuity in the fragmented history of a language, in this case Yiddish or Hebrew, this abnormality may be transformed into a productive force, and discontinuity often involves the necessity of translation. Translation from a language in its post-vernacular mode can lead to abandoning the original altogether, or to striving towards a return to some imagined quote-unquote authenticity. But instead, Cohen's story suggests a third option, which is lingering in discontinuity. And it does so through the character of the uneasy translator. In order to linger in a space of discontinuity, I also propose embracing Sol Zeretz's approach, who calls for the application of, quote, reading strategies that would see translation as constitutive of modern Jewish culture rather than one of its consequences. Cohen's story is an example for how Jewish American literature can employ the post-vernacular mode not to mourn a Jewish language, but to engage it in what I choose to call a translational space. But what do I mean by that? I mean that although such a text acknowledges the inaccessibility of a Jewish language to Jews who don't speak it, it doesn't dismiss it simply as a symbol of a lost Jewish past, but instead the text engages this symbol of loss with new stories through a process of metaization, through metafiction. By making the act of translation visible and problematizing it, Cohen's story narrates past and future losses as part of a contemporary story. And I will conclude by saying that according to this view, we can not only observe the symbolic charge of Jewish languages, which may lead us to desperate conclusions about untranslatability, but we can also interrogate what can be gained beyond it, what can be understood when a Jewish original is negated twice over, when it is simultaneously desired and dismissed, or in other words, when it is translated with evident unease and exposes this unease. So I hope these questions can be discussed in this forum, but meanwhile, thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Shiri. Thank you for both of you. So I invite you to let me know if you have questions. You can raise your hand or write it on the chat. So we will start with Judith Müller, please.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. Thank you both for two very interesting presentations. I have one question for each of you. I will start with Shiri. When I listened to your talk, I was thinking about the influence of those languages like Yiddish and Hebrew on the writing process as languages that are inherited, like from the previous generation or generations. And especially if in the American context, Yiddish and Hebrew are not the only inherited languages. They are, of course, for the Jewish community, but I was wondering to what extent these processes of translation might be also important for example, the Spanish-speaking community, like, for example, second generation second generation authors who do have a background in Spanish, for example, but write in English and then kind of reflect in their writing on the loss of Spanish. Yeah, so that's for Shiri. And for Izzy, I was wondering, you were focusing on the translations between Yiddish and other languages, and I was wondering to what extent a translation within those different dialects is required. This is, of course, a little bit over a little bit. Sorry, I lost my words. I was asking myself to what extent there are complications or irritations in communication between those different communities, because of course they are constantly in exchange. People from the US are going to the UK and probably have family connections also with the Hasidic community in Israel. But I was really asking myself to what extent are there problems in communication or misunderstandings when it comes to these different dialects. Thank you.
Shiri, would you like to start?
Yes, I will start. Thank you so much, Judith. So I am not an expert at all when it comes to American literature, so I can't say anything really about inherited languages in other communities that are not Jewish. I'm more interested in comparing various Jewish literatures. But I am fascinated by the notion of an inherited language, because I think as an author, if you think that you have inherited something, it immediately creates a network that you can share with other writers, a network of intertextuality, of symbols, even if you don't have the content of what is conveyed through these symbols. And this way, I think the notion of postmolecularity is very helpful for understanding how these connections are made, even when you are so far removed from what you would call, and a lot of people may debate that, a source. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Judith. Excellent question. So I'll say a few things. Firstly, all Hasidic Yiddish dialects are perfectly mutually intelligible. The biggest difference would be between Israel and Anglophone countries. They're still mutually intelligible, but there'll be very obvious differences. Now, when it comes to the written language, there's somewhat of a Klaussprach when it comes to Hasidic Yiddish as well, because, like you pointed out, of a shared international literature. So, for example, newspapers across the whole Hasidic world basically come from New York. And newspapers like the Yid, the Blatt, and others have an outsized influence, and these are read in Israel, in London, and so on. And in the other direction, a weekly magazine like Belachtungen, which is published in Jerusalem, is also read across the Hasidic world. And they've similar to what Yiva's project was, they have a kind of Klaussprach which avoids dialectical terms and kind of writes terms that will be understandable to all speakers. A much bigger problem is understandability between the Hasidic dialects and actual Yiddish standard dialects or other pre-war dialects. So interestingly, Hasidim find it very difficult to read the classics in Yiddish literature, like Peretz, Singer, Shem Aleichem, and it's mainly because of the Slavisms. For historical reasons, which I won't go into, the Hasidic Yiddish dialect basically doesn't have a large part of the Slavic components. It's mainly because it comes from Hungarian dialects which didn't have it, but that's a whole conversation. So all the Slavic words in Peretz, in Zinga, and so on are really opaque to Hasidim. And actually, I've always a future project perhaps that I want to do is translate, the Yiddish classics from their original into Hasidic Yiddish. That would be an interesting project.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you. Arnaud Bicard, s'il te plaît.
Yes, Thank you very much. Thank you for both very nice papers. I wanted to ask questions to both of you, actually. I would have one question for Izzy, or maybe two questions, actually. The first one would be, could you tell that there is some kind of standardization inside the Hasidic word, and if yes, where does it come from inside the various dialects? And the second question would be, would you, if I've understood correctly what you said, you translate a lot, and I figured out that you translate mostly for British Hasidic audience. Would you feel comfortable translating for Israeli in an Israeli context, for example, for a Hasidic audience in Israel? And my question for Shiri would be, I was very interested in what you said, both about Cynthia Ozick and Joshua Cohen. I don't know the text of Joshua Cohen, so I don't know if my question is relevant, but I'll ask it. The question is, I was wondering if in the fiction he wrote, the geopolitical problems, issues Israel is facing plays a role. If the fiction of possibly post-vernacular Hebrew is linked to the current issues. I know this is something that is coming back in the work of many Hebrew, modern Hebrew, recent Hebrew writers in Berlin, for example, who live now in Berlin. So that's my question. Is it linked? Isn't it linked? Yeah.
So I'll start. Thanks for your questions, Arno. As to your first question, I touched upon that in my response to Judith, and the answer is yes. There is a standard. It's perhaps not as rigid as the Yivu standard. It's not academically rigid, but there is absolutely a standard, and these are set by the main legacy publications. I've mentioned a few of them. So in the newspaper realm, the Yid, published in New York, and it's been published for many decades now, is a standard setter. There's Malus, which is published also in New York, which is a monthly magazine for the family. Belachtung, I've touched upon. So these kind of legacy, prestigious media, they share a lot of features, and there's absolutely a standard. Unfortunately, academically, this hasn't been adequately researched yet. So this is a PhD waiting to happen. As to your second question, I do translate a lot, in fact, for New York Yiddish, and the differences between New York and English Hasidic Yiddish are not as vast, and as long as you know to substitute the Anglicisms in the right accent, you're more or less fine. When it comes to Israel, the differences are a bit bigger. I rarely do it. I have done a significant piece of translation once for Israel. Ideally, I recommend an Israeli translator to do it. What I did, which isn't necessarily kind of all you need to do, but what I did is essentially replacing all the Anglicisms with Hebraisms, which is just a start, because it doesn't mean that just because a term, an Anglicism has become accepted, that an equivalent Hebraism will be accepted in Israel. But as a rule, most Yiddish speakers in Israel, if not all, are very familiar with Hebrew and use it. So basically, most Yiddish speakers in Israel are bilingual, which cannot be said about Yiddish speakers in Anglophone countries. Many men in New York and in London do not speak English as well. So it's a bit easier in Israel to use Hebraisms because you can assume that most people will understand them.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Arno, thank you. I will try to answer your question. I didn't focus on it, but first I also copied a link to the chat box that refers to this story because it's available online, and I hope that if anyone takes anything from my presentation is getting to know Joshua Cohen's work more because he's fascinating. So it does refer to political tensions, and there's a lot of content there. And I think Cohen's view of Hebrew and Jewish languages in general is very intricate in that he does see it as a sort of source. Of course, this is a basis for a collective identity and so forth, but it is a very complicated one. And I think he sees, yeah, for a good reason, discontinuity in the history of Hebrew. And he says this is a language that was mostly written for many decades, maybe save for very few exceptions. And suddenly to build a nation state upon it is strange, not only for the nation state, but for people who have to write literature in this nation state. And he complicates it a lot. I highly recommend his novel, The Netanyahus, which is also a lot about nationality and Judaism and language. But my assumption about the purpose of his work, or I think the issue that he keeps coming back to, is that everything is formed through language, through the instability of language. So of course your identity is unstable because you can't find a linear history of a language to rely on. And this is fun. This is like a source of a lot of stylistic play and a lot of code switching that he does throughout his work.
And maybe one more question. Do you know if he speaks Hebrew?
I heard him speak Hebrew on the Israeli radio.
Okay.
So he
Okay.
speaks Hebrew quite well.
So
And
it
he,
does.
also, I can say that this wasn't very relevant to my presentation, but in some private correspondence, he said something about this story being based on his own experience as he translated a Hebrew poet, another Hebrew poet named Yitzhak Laor, who is a very disputed character in Israeli culture, and a very leftist one as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a few more minutes if you have more questions.
Can I ask Izzy something?
Yes, of course.
So you focused in your presentation on the purpose of conveying information as you translate into Hasidic Yiddish, but I was wondering if you have any other purposes, and also who is the commissioner, if this is not about conveying information in the case of communities which don't speak the local language.
If I understood your question correctly, this is a question of genres. So I focused on informational/guidance literature. So specifically, when we have to translate COVID guidance into Yiddish, medical advice, government communication, as well as also perhaps educational literature, like the work I do in translating physics material into Yiddish. That is very different to, for example, promotional material like advertisements, which I'll briefly touch on. For example, when it comes to the Anglicisms, you are much more free to actually follow, advertisement incorporates more slang and the way people speak. And in fact, if you look at advertisements in Yiddish, it's full of Anglicisms. And in fact, it's a way of kind of connecting to the audience, and we speak your language and the way you speak. And obviously, I didn't talk about literature, so translating stories and that kind of thing, which also has very different purposes and very different rules. So that's why I focused on conveying information, because that's what the genre is about. Who commissions them? Well, in many cases, it's government bodies, or in cases of educational material, it's me or others.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just curious about the variety that it may or may not have, but I was
That's
kind of ask.
Another genre to mention as well, which I didn't touch on, is very technical, legalistic literature or medical. So, for example, You have I've worked on a big project to, I think there was this medical provider, a big pharmaceutical company that was translating their legal fine print in Yiddish, probably for legalistic reasons, so they can't be sued if a Yiddish speaker did something stupid. And this was very legalistic technical language, which no one is ever going to read. And there, of necessity, you're going to be using a lot of internationalisms. It's almost unavoidable on every sentence. And there again, there's very different rules. It can be more technical language. You don't have to worry so much if it's accessible, because let's face it, in no language are these kind of fine print accessible. So again, these are very different rules.
Easy. So when you have to produce a neologism, do you have a method? How do you think about a new word that you don't have in Yiddish any source for it?
So yeah, that's an excellent question. As a rule, I have 3 or 4 sources from which I can draw on, and then I have to weigh them up. So the most obvious first thing you do is look at Yiddish words. So you go to the Yiddish dictionaries and see if there's a Yiddish word. Even if there is, it doesn't mean that it will be the best word in contemporary Hasidic Yiddish, but that's one source of inspiration. You can go to German. I know some Yiddish purists would be outraged by that and they could shout Deutschmerism, but actually German can be a source of inspiration. And in fact, Hasidic Yiddish is much more comfortable with Deutschmerisms. I don't remember who, but there's a paper written about it. And this comes from the Hungarian Yiddish influence, which took in a lot of Deutschmerisms. Another source is Hebrew. Yiddish has always taken Hebrew elements. And finally, I go to English, especially internationalisms. English can be a very good guide. Once you have these sources, you weigh up, and it's a case-by-case basis. You have to think which terms may you have come across in the literature or similar terms. How do they sound? For example, with English terms, if they have a W in them or a TH in them, that's a bit of a problem to Yiddishize. So you weigh up these things and you make choices.
Right, thank you. Shiri, so I think we all deal with this concept of post-vernacularity with all the Jewish languages, and especially in translation. And so would you say that post-vernacularity became in itself a topic in contemporary Jewish literature? In a way, it really produces maybe, I don't know, new texts talking about post-vernacularity.
Yeah, what I'm trying, or like this was still in its very experimental phase, but what I'm trying to connect here is the fact that you have language as a joint marker of identity, which is also destabilized, and you're trying to hold on to something. And this approach to language that is more symbolic than semantic, according to Chandler's definition, I think in contemporary literature, but I wonder if this was present even before, I think it's very conducive to metafictional play, to stories that are highly reflexive, not only of this state of affairs where identity and languages are destabilized, or the connection between the two, but also to how do you tell these stories of discontinuity and destabilized languages, and even the ability to speak to your own audience and who is your audience. I think all of these are very present in contemporary Jewish literature in several languages that I encountered.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I think we can even start to talk about a new genre in Jewish literatures that really goes to this direction of metafictional or meta in general.
Thank you for offering this. I hope so. I want to discover a genre, but for now, what I think it's mostly that it's influenced by contemporary tendencies towards autofiction, or the blurring of fact and fiction in contemporary literature. So I don't think it's a very Jewish phenomenon. I think it's a translation of a very global tendency in literature. So you just use what fashion you have at hand to deal with contemporary Jewish issues.
Yeah. Okay, but maybe it resignifies with like there is a new necessity for this kind of metafictional works.
I would agree. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we are just in time. We have to close this very interesting panel. Thank you very much, Izzy and Shiri. We have now 14 minutes pause, and then we will continue with our second panel of the day. Please stay connected and see you at 1 p.m. 50.